All right, class. Well, welcome to our very first unit that we're going to be doing online here. And we're going to start into chapter 11, and we're going to talk about American slavery. This is a tricky subject to cover in the short amount of time that we have, and I truly wish that we had more time to dedicate to it. However, as you get more into high school and even college, you'll have multiple opportunities to really dive into it if it's something that you find interesting and would like to learn more about it. Typically, I'm not one that recommends reading material, but probably one of the best books on it is American Slavery, American Freedom. I highly recommend this book because it is a fascinating look at American freedoms and then how that translates over into the issue of slavery and the development of slavery. So if you're ever curious as to learn more about it, that book is perfect for further review and understanding of the subject itself. So let's get started here. We are going to talk about a few different things. And where we're going to start off at is the Western Africa slave trade. Now, a vast majority of slaves that come to the New World, and especially the Americas and the colonies, come from West Africa. When we look at this, it's from a number of reasons. First off, West Africa is where the Portuguese initially established forts and trade locations as they make their way around the Horn of Africa and over into the Indies and into China for the spice trade. As they land in these ports, they make contacts with local kingdoms, and with those kingdoms themselves, they are able to engage in trading for African slaves themselves. So that's where we start off at when looking at slavery. So for the most part, they're not going to be East African, although they could be possible. But for the most part, when we focus on studying slavery, it's the West African slaves. Now, before the Europeans arrive, there is a complex culture in place that has been influenced by traditional African beliefs, and also there has been a movement of Muslims into the area. So with that, the overall makeup, both culturally and has really been changed quite a bit because of these outside influences, and it changes even more once Europeans are brought into the mix. So they have a pretty hierarchical structure like you would see in European kingdoms, where you do have like a king, nobility, lower classes, warrior classes. They're fairly similar in structure to what you see throughout most evolution of human cultures. So this is pretty typical of where you're going to be at no matter where you're at in the world, but they have very unique and very interesting spiritual and religious beliefs. So again, if you are interested again in college, these are some classes that you can take to really deep dive into them. But what we're looking at is if we look at how worldwide slavery was itself, worldwide slavery really it starts off, we look at time frames before the 1400s and after the 1400s. When we look at slavery itself, it has pretty much historically always been around. It's in ancient cultures such as Rome, even Greece, Mesopotamia, pretty much anywhere there's been civilization, there's been some form of slavery. Now, how it's placed in culture and in society is different than what we look with African slavery in the United States and the Americas in general. Slaves were not necessarily mistreated or abused. Often their owners used them as servants. But admittedly, of course, no matter what, when you're a slave, you have little to no freedoms, and you can be abused or even killed by your masters, no matter which type you were into. But some of the slaves in these older cultures typically were there because they may have owned a debt, or their family had owned a debt, and they were sold into slavery to pay that debt. And there's a possibility too that you could work your way out of slavery, or your overseer or your owner could grant you freedoms. Now, they're not overly common, but at the same time, you do have the ability to escape slavery in general before the 1400s, when we're really looking at the evolution of slavery. When we were looking also at people in general who was enslaved, it didn't really follow along racial lines. Therefore, a Roman could be from Italy or the Italian region and still be enslaved. It wasn't necessarily you were African, Middle Eastern, Chinese, or anything like that. It's just if you were around, if you were captured in war, you might end up as a slave. So that's one thing to understand the difference between them, okay? All right, how did it change? Well, again, we talk about the Portuguese showing up, and the Portuguese engage and are the very first group of Europeans that start bringing over African slaves into the New World. Once this starts coming into place, you see the differences between the two. You see a European group that is enslaving an African group. It's not Africans enslaving Europeans, it's Europeans enslaving Africans. So it does start to become based on different cultures and different races is how the evolution starts off into slavery. So that is one key thing that you need to take away and understand, okay? Secondly, slavery, depending upon where you were going at, was typically permanent. There was no way that you were going to get out of slavery. Unless, when we look at the colonies and into the United States, early slavery, when it comes to African slaves, were somewhat treated the same as an indentured servant. So they might be able to sue or get their freedom after a certain number of years. But again, when we're looking more at slavery, though, during this time frame, we're looking at it from a more permanent standpoint. So make sure you get that clarity that this is more of a permanent condition. And lastly, in some of the older cultures, you would have you would have some of the slaves who had rights and some slaves who did not have rights. And so when we talk about that, when we look into it, slaves, when they come over to the New World, they have zero rights. There's no rights at all granted to them. They can't vote, they can't represent themselves, they often lack any legal representation too. So they pretty much are slaves completely. They don't have any way around it. So that's one thing that we're going to look at too. And they're considered in the end, ultimately, and we'll talk about this when we get closer to the Civil War, slaves are considered property. They're not considered people. Remember when we talk about this, they are considered property. That's a key differentiation between these, is often back in the historical times, they were not seen explicitly as property. Of course, you could be bought and sold back in the early portions of world civilization, but in American slavery, you could be bought and sold quite readily and quite quickly. So throughout the time frames that we're going to be looking at, especially the early portions of the slave trade, the Portuguese dominated. Other European groups do really try to get involved with it, but they don't have the relationships that the Portuguese develop. Now, eventually, the Dutch move in, and the Dutch start to take over the slave trade too, and even Spain does get involved with it. The other European powers did. Typically, though, if a European power was going to be engaged in slaving activities, it was usually because they had permission from the Dutch, the Portuguese, or the Spanish. So they would be granted, like when we were talking about, say, the Spanish, they would grant something called the Ascencio, which they had granted to multiple kingdoms over the time frame. And basically it gave whoever they granted at the time the right to engage in slave trading within their territories. It's a pretty interesting way to look at it. It usually was won by treaty after a war. But if you were really interested into it, I've done my whole entire master's thesis about the British gaining access to that particular portion of the slave trade. And it discusses kind of if it was profitable or not. So if you're ever interested, let me know and I'll share some of my research with you, okay? One of the misnomers is that often is that Europeans showed up on the coastlines of these African kingdoms and went inward and started to attack native people or capture native people and enslaving them. Pretty much most slaves do come from other kingdoms within Africa itself. So these kingdoms would go to war, they would capture prisoners of war, and then they would enslave them, and then they would sell them to the Europeans when they came out there. Fascinating aspect about Africa during this time frame is when we look at disease and what kills large portions of the native populations of the United States and in the Americas in general, Same thing happened to Europeans if they went to Africa. Often those diseases were so intense that it would kill 90% of the Europeans that would attempt to move into the more jungle-ish regions of Africa. So you don't necessarily see slave traders taking the time to go deep into Africa to gather these slaves. It was usually presented to them through other African kings, like I said, prisoners of war. This becomes a problem later on within Africa. It really changes African culture because there's more warfare activity in the African continent, so more people can capture prisoners and sell them as slaves. So the slave trade really does shift and change culture in Africa itself, not just here in America, and not just from a trade and from a work standpoint, but particularly it does really impact Africa. So key points to remember on that front, okay? So one thing that when we look at African slavery and we try to and we learn about how people come here, it's through a trade called the Middle Passage. Now, the Middle Passage was definitely one of the most brutal ship voyages that a person could be stuck and travel across the ocean on. Slaves were often taken onto these ships. They would be chained side by side, and sometimes there would be less than 18 inches between them and the next deck. So you'd be like stacked barely with just enough room for your body to slide in. And if you were fed at all, really, I mean, you'd be fed because it's a 3-month trip, but you'd be fed usually rancid or old food. The slavers would have to come along and feed it to you. Often you were left just if you had to use the restroom, you had to do it right there where you live at. So it created situations of disease and illness and sickness that kills lots of people. And when we talk about lots of people, some of these slaving voyages, there was up to 10 to 20% of the slaves would never reach to the Americas. They would be dead on the ship. There is a website that was compiled by a group of researchers it's called the Slave Trading Database. And the reason why we know numbers is because these people took the time and they found all the slaving records from the slave ships and they compiled it onto a sheet. And it's actually an interactive tool that you can use that can show you every slave ship that came from the Americas, from Africa, and you can see how many slaves and where they went to and how many were dropped off. You can even see the records of how many they left with and how many they showed up with and who died along the way. It's a really interesting historical view of how prolific the African slave trade really was when we try to study it. And you can even look up individual captains, their boats. The whole thing is, when it comes down to researching and looking at these, it's a valuable tool to understand how devastating it was to the African people over a 400-year period. When we look at it, 12 million people are displaced that are brought to the Americas during this 4-year period. It's a huge number of people that are enslaved. It's almost incomprehensible how many people were taken into slavery during this time frame. All right, so how do we get them to the colonies and how do we look at it from a colonial perspective? If you guys remember, we talk about the triangular trade, the trade where it goes from, you start off at like maybe in Africa itself, you come over to the Caribbean, they trade for sugar and other goods, and then it comes up to the colonies buy those goods and they make a profit, and then it can swing all the way back down to Africa again, where the whole cycle starts over. So understand and remember the triangular trade is how people come here. So when we're trying to review this and you're trying to understand it, and if it comes up in a test, remember the triangular trade, okay? Now when we talk about where do slaves go, well, most of them end up in the Caribbean and South America, and most notably in Brazil. People, when they think about the slave trade, they look at the United States or the 13 colonies in general, and we think that a huge number of slaves come here. Now, when I talk about these numbers, I'm not trying to discount them in any way, shape, or form. Remember, 2 million people enslaved and 12 million people enslaved. Out of that, about 3% of them come to the 13 colonies and the United States after it's established. So about 300,000 people. So why? Why do the American colonies not need quite as much as like Brazil, like the Caribbean? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. First and foremost, when you came here, your life was pretty much, it was dangerous when you were a slave. Either you'd work on a tobacco or sugar plantation, and often you're working in that South American or Caribbean heat. You'd suffer from heat exhaustion that would kill you, or you'd be plagued by diseases, and in some cases you'd be tortured or beaten to death by your slave owner. Other things is like working in the sugar plantations, especially. The jobs themselves were very dangerous. There was crushers, there was machines that spun at a high rate of speed that people would get caught into. And a lot of these workers were working up to 16 to 18 hours a day with minimal food. So some of them would just simply waste away and starve to death. And so why are there so many people being brought over? Well, there's no natural reproduction in an environment like this. Most of these slaves are living for maybe about 2 to 3 years, sometimes up to 5. There's a very rare that live much past that. They're basically worked to death. So that's why there's a huge number of slaves that are brought into the Americas, especially the Caribbean, is because they needed it for population replenishment once the other slaves would die. The only reason why they were able to do this is because that sugar was highly profitable. And when I mean highly profitable, it's one of the most expensive commodities, along with rum, that were existing during this era. That's why they were able to do it. When we look at the Americas, when we look at the tobacco plantations, they're not nearly profitable enough. Especially early on, they don't even use slaves when we first look at it. Instead, they're using more indentured servants because of the low profitability of tobacco farming, okay? Now, admittedly too, slaves, when they were in the Caribbean, more often than not, eventually they would get sick of being tortured and abused and beaten by their masters. There's numerous stories about slave revolts that rise up throughout this time frame, where slaves would, since there was often 2 to 4, maybe even 10,000 to 1 slaves compared to Europeans, they would revolt and then they would turn on their masters or their overseers and they would kill them. And they would usually kill them in pretty horrific manners, chop them up, other things, because I mean, if you were enslaved and beaten for 5 years of your life, you probably aren't going to look upon those people in a very positive light, and therefore you were more than willing to take them out in order to gain your freedom. What this starts to do is it starts to drive Europeans out of those colonies and leaving just nothing more than overseers over it, and many of them moved up into the colonial America. That's why you start to see the slave trade take off in colonial Americas, because you have people that are used to having slaves bringing their slaves over. That's why there's a growth in here, okay? That gives you kind of a perspective. All right, so what about America? So let's move away from the Caribbean. Let's move to America and talk about American slavery. It doesn't really get established until late in the 1600s and into the 1700s, and that's because indentured servitude. Now, when we go to our next unit, we will talk more about indentured servants, but let's focus again on American slavery. Like I said, only 300,000 brought over here. The reason why they didn't need to bring more is because of natural population growth. If you're living in the harsh environments of the Caribbean and you're a woman and you're having to work, often the work is so brutal that you cannot get pregnant or stay pregnant. In the American colonies, natural progress would happen where women could actually bear children. And then you had, like I said, the natural increase of population where you don't have to replenish the slave population because they lasted, they lived longer. And often, okay, I'm not going to discount this because it depends on the slave owner. It was not necessarily quite as brutal, but it still had lots of brutality associated with slavery, especially when we move closer to the Civil War. You'll see slave owners get more and more violent when it comes to keeping their slaves and how they treat runaway slaves. During this time frame, of course, though, still there was a lot of hard work for them to do. Rice growing is very labor intensive, so is tobacco. So a lot of these crops required hard work, heavy, intense work. And so even if you were living up in the Americas, you were still subjected to very hard work environment. And also, especially in the Virginia region and the southern colonies and southern states, they too suffered from quite a bit of disease early on. So large numbers of slaves would also die based upon disease. It does take a while really for the slave trade to take off though in the United States, solely based upon the fact that indentured servitude was cheaper initially than buying slaves. So what we're going to look at though is we'll go into our next section here, 11.2, where we'll talk more about the nuance of slavery and the different types of slaves that were out there, or different types of slavery, because it is slightly different from each other. All right, thanks for watching this video today, students. We'll see you again tomorrow. Make sure you've taken some good notes and review over the PowerPoint that's going to be included with this video. And I will see you tomorrow. Thanks again.